All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for the first in our series of Hot Topics lectures for the summer of 2016. I'm Melissa Scanlon. I'm the director of the Environmental Law Center and the Associate Dean of the Environmental Program. And I will be seeing you here every Tuesday and Thursday from noon to 1 throughout the summer. We have 17 speakers lined up for our Hot Topics series. We're going to be covering a wide array of topics, everything from what you're going to hear today about distributed energy to national security concerns related to the melting of the Arctic. So we will take you through a vast trajectory of topics throughout the summer, and I assure you that you'll be enriched by the end of it if you stick with us. Or pop in as your schedule permits. The lecture series is offered for CLE credit. Each one you can get 1 credit, and you just need to sign up in the back of the room to get your credits for CLE. It's a brown bag event, so feel free to bring in your lunch. And the process for the lectures is that we have a speaker who will come up, speak to you, give you the lecture for about a half an hour, and then we'll have Q&A after that. So hold your questions for the Q&A period, and then we will say goodbye at about 5 to 1 so that people who have afternoon classes can get on their way to the classes. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome Steve Letendre. He's a professor of economics and environmental studies and the director of renewable energy and ecological design at Green Mountain College in Poultney, Vermont. His research focuses, not surprisingly, on economic analysis of emerging environmental technologies and the development of policies and regulations to promote sustainable energy. He has published over 45 technical articles in a variety of energy issues, and he's worked on a lot of funded research with different organizations, including the California Air Resources Board, the National Renewable Energy Lab, the Transportation Research Center at the University of Vermont, and the list goes on. He is currently the board treasurer for the Renewable Energy Vermont, and he has a PhD in energy and environmental policy from the University of Delaware. Last but not least, he is a regular professor for Vermont Law School in our distance learning program, and sometimes teaches in our summer program, where he most recently taught environmental economics and markets. So today he's going to be speaking to us about Utility 2.0, making the transition to a sustainable and distributed energy future. Please join me in welcoming Professor Letendre.
All right, well, good afternoon. How's everyone doing today? Good. How many of you are not from Vermont? All right, welcome. So far, so good? Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Melissa, for that kind introduction. I'd also like to just thank Melissa for inviting me to participate in this action-packed, jam-packed series of hot topics here at Vermont Law School. And it's quite an honor to kick that off here in summer 2016. It's been a great honor for me to be part of the Vermont Law School community, teaching in an online program. I'm also very happy that Green Mountain College, my primary day job in Vermont Law School, have built this excellent relationship over the past several years. Students at Green Mountain College who complete the pre-law program and do well in their courses can come to Vermont Law School in an articulation agreement to study the JD program. We've also had a number of students over the years that have come from Green Mountain College and have studied the Masters in Environmental Law and Policy, and more recently, the program that Kevin Jones is affiliated with, the Masters in Energy Law and Regulation, or Regulation of Law, MERL, Master in Regulation Law. So it's a great partnership, lots of great things happening in Vermont. Vermont Law School, of course, is the national leader in environmental law and policy. Green Mountain College as well has been recognized nationally for its environmental programs. So it's an excellent partnership. I'm glad to be here with you this afternoon. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about my experience kind of tracking the utility industry over the past 2 decades, from my PhD work at the University of Delaware back in the mid-1990s to my work today, working for a variety of different organizations, as Melissa mentioned, currently working with Energy, large national energy company, with a funded project in NYSERDA that I'll mention later in my presentation this afternoon. Right to the advance, I guess. So it's no surprise we've had environmental visionaries over the past couple of decades telling us that we must transition from our primarily fossil fuel-based energy systems to renewable-based energy systems. So a fellow Vermonter, Bill McKibben, you see in the top here, is telling us it's critical that we address the climate imperative, that we move toward low-carbon forms of energy. Below Bill McKibben is one of my personal heroes, Amory Lovins. He's with the Rocky Mountain Institute, and I love this quote: "Fire made us human, fossil fuels made us modern, but we need new fire that makes us safe, secure, healthy, and durable." Excellent. So his work over the years at the Rocky Mountain Institute has been promoting, again, this transition from fossil fuel-based to renewable-based energy systems. Most recently in his framework called Reinventing Fire, he argues for this urgency for this transition. So what I think is particularly exciting about where we are today, not only are these visionaries out there telling us we've got to make this transition, but what we're seeing increasingly is individuals within the industry, within the utility industry, are also making these claims about us being in the midst of this major transition. This is Mary Powell. She is the president and CEO of Green Mountain Power, and that's the utility that serves the majority of Vermonters. And this was part of a press release that was sent out when Green Mountain Power announced a collaborative effort with Tesla to partner with them to distribute their Tesla Powerwalls, these home energy storage systems. So in this quote, she talks about this major energy transition that we're in the middle of, and she wants Green Mountain Power to be a leader in that transition. So similarly, another industry professional, Lisa Wood with the Edison Foundation, again references this notion that we're in the midst of a profound transition. Okay, so again, not only are those environmentalists saying we've got to make this transition, we're now starting to see evidence within the industry that there is this process of change that we are engaging in. So what we're here to talk about this afternoon is, what is this transition all about? So my goal here is to explore with you the nature of this transition that people are talking about. Specifically, I will share with you my thoughts on where we are and where we might be transitioning to, and the fact that this has been a lengthy process, but it really does seem to be accelerating, which is quite exciting. So my interpretation of what these industry folks are talking about is this transition from a centralized grid architecture to a more distributed energy system. So historically, the grid is characterized by large central station generators that produce huge quantities of power, and that power is distributed across great distances through our transmission and distribution network. And that's been the traditional utility model for well over 100 years. So this transition that they're talking about is driven by disruptive technologies, economic forces, and it's moving us towards a more distributed energy architecture. And what that means is that means within the distribution network, we are beginning to site generators, energy storage devices that are closer to where the energy is being consumed within the distribution system. So this is, in my interpretation of what these folks are talking about. This transition is in this process of moving from the centralized architecture to a more distributed architecture. So the 3 characteristics of this, again, are distributed energy resources And I refer to distributed energy resources, or DERs for short, as encompassing distributed generation, such as photovoltaics, distributed wind power systems, fuel cell technologies. Also could include energy storage devices, battery storage. We'll talk about using electric vehicles as grid storage. And also this distributed energy resource concept could also encompass efficiency and demand response, making loads more responsive to conditions on the grid. So all of these distributed energy resources are fundamentally challenging this centralized grid architecture. Two critically important related concepts are smart grids and microgrids. And we have amongst us an expert on smart grid technology, Kevin Jones and others here have written extensively on this concept. But smart grids involve overlaying sensors and information technology on the physical grid, the delivery of electrons across the system, to try to optimize the supply and consumption of that power in a way that creates efficiencies, better utilizing the assets that we've invested in over time. Similarly, this concept of a microgrid. A microgrid, you can think about in its simplest terms as having a gas generator in your basement or outside your home. When the grid power goes out, the generator kicks on, and you have power for your lights, for your refrigerator, for your appliances. And that basic small-scale home microgrid is being expanded to communities and campuses, where these communities or these campuses can disconnect from the grid if the grid power goes down and still provide vital services to those communities, to those campuses. And once the grid comes back on, it seamlessly reconnects to the grid. And here in Vermont, there are a couple of demonstration microgrid projects. Where I live in central Vermont, Rutland, Green Mountain Power has a project, a 2-megawatt solar power plant on an old landfill with some large battery storage systems, and they are creating a microgrid where they can power the local high school in case of a larger grid outage. So these concepts are really coming of age. So again, to reiterate, the transition that Mary Powell and others are talking about is this transition from a centralized architecture of our grid to a more distributed architecture. So what I want to do is I want to talk about three major forces which are leading this transition, making these distributed energy resources more economic, more viable. So the first major driver is an economic driver, and this is the reality that the economics of our centralized power generating systems have largely been exhausted, the economies of scale. So this is a historic graph from the early 1900s showing what the price per kilowatt hour of energy was back in the early 1900s, controlled for inflation. So this was when Thomas Edison was stringing up folks in New York City, providing lighting from his generating station on Pearl Street. They were paying an equivalent of $4 per kilowatt hour. Okay, today we pay 15 cents, 14 cents per kilowatt hour. So what happened over the preceding decades, they built larger power plants, thermal efficiencies improved, they started connecting them in an interconnected grid system, and year after year, the price of electricity would decline. Larger generators, larger networks, the marginal price of electricity was declining historically for many, many years. So this chart here shows more recent average prices for electricity in the United States, and we can see that the prices continued to decline. Economies of scale, larger systems, lower costs, were virtually exhausted by the 60s and the 70s. So if you built a larger power plant, it didn't necessarily mean your costs would go down. Of course, gas turbines appeared in the 50s and 60s, and that also contributed to that declining marginal price. But you can see now for the past 30 or 40 years, the average price of electricity has basically bounced around that 10 cent per kilowatt hour price, again controlled for inflation. So we've essentially exhausted the economies of scale, larger, more complex power generators connected to this interconnected transmission distribution system. So number one, so what's the driver that these folks are talking about? Exhaustion of economies of scale of centralized generating technologies. The second major driver is the fact that our delivery costs have been rising over time. You can think about the price of electricity as two components, the generation of the electricity and the delivery of the electricity. And over the past couple decades, the cost of delivering that power has increased. And now, based on the Department of Energy's estimates, accounts for about 40% of the price of electricity. So electricity that you pay for, about half of that, 40%, is just to cover the delivery of the electron from where it's produced to where it's consumed, for our transmission and distribution system. So the Energy Information Administration estimates that that cost of delivering power is going to continue to increase in the coming decades at 1.2% per year. So that delivery charge is going to continue to increase. And that's driven by the fact that our transmission distribution system was built decades ago, needs to be refurbished, needs to be maintained, needs to be upgraded and replaced. And so that represents real cost to utility companies that build and maintain those infrastructure. So not only are the economies of scale and generation exhausted, and now we're seeing increasing costs associated with delivering that electricity from the point of production to the point of consumption. And the third major driver, thanks to smart lawyers that come out of Vermont Law School, is utility companies are being held increasingly accountable for the environmental impacts associated with the combustion of fossil fuel, in particular coal. So over the past couple of decades, and to comply with the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, significant control technologies have to have been installed, which increases the price of power from those resources. The EPA projects from the 2005 regulations in terms of sulfur, NOx, and mercury. They projected that it would increase the cost to the industry of $47.8 billion between 2007 and 2025. Okay, so this increased cost of environmental compliance is also a major driver, which is leading to this transition to a more distributed grid architecture. So this stands in stark contrast to what we see to the cost structures of distributed energy resources. Okay, and this is particularly here I'm highlighting solar photovoltaic technology, the direct conversion of sunlight into electrical energy. As many of you who study this industry are aware, the price has been declining precipitously over the past 5 to 10 years. This chart here is a little dated from 2012, but it shows what analysts call an experience curve. As you double production, the price of the technology declines. And we are well past where we were in 2012. Just the past couple of years, the price of solar photovoltaic technology has declined significantly. So today, they're quoting large solar projects, 3, 4, 5 cents per kilowatt hour, installed cost of $3 per watt or $3,000 per kilowatt. 5 years ago, when I installed a very tiny system in my home, 2.1 kilowatts, it was $6,500 per kilowatt. So the price have come down just in that 5 years by better than half. So this stands in stark contrast to what we're seeing with this centralized energy system that has characterized the utility industry for most of its history. And today, the global manufacturing of photovoltaic technology has exploded. We now have the capacity across the globe. If you add up all the manufacturing plants across the globe, we have the capacity to pump out every year 60 gigawatts of solar modules, 60 gigawatts. That's equivalent to 60 large nuclear power plants. Of course, on an energy basis, because the capacity factor is much lower, it's not the equivalent amount of energy. But it's just to put that into perspective, it is a huge capacity to build these solar photovoltaic modules. In the future, it's very promising for further price reductions for solar. Reduced material inputs, making thinner silicon wafers, depositing new thin film materials on substrates, higher conversion efficiencies from engineering and design, and lower energy paybacks, the amount of time it takes to pay back the energy it took to manufacture the module in the first place, about 2 years, 2.5 years today, and that's anticipated to decline as well. So again, when we think about distributed energy technologies, solar photovoltaics in particular, the future is indeed quite bright for future price declines. We've already seen significant price declines in the past 5 to 10 years. So for other distributed energy resources, in this case, lithium-ion battery technology, the story is just beginning. This is a projection today where we stand in terms of the cost per kilowatt hour for energy storage technologies. And they're projecting similar gains with solar photovoltaic that we saw with solar photovoltaics in terms of the cost of energy storage devices based on lithium-ion technology. So again, the story is just getting started for lithium-ion battery technologies. And there are many other distributed energy technologies out there. Fuel cell technology, I haven't tracked that as closely as I have the solar or lithium industries, but there's also exciting gains there as well. So the future, again, is quite bright for these technologies. So I've highlighted here this transition, centralized distributed energy architectures. What's driving that, what's creating these headaches for these utility executives is the fact that the economics are really changing for these distributed energy resources. Another important factor that's driving this, and I'm going to go back a little bit in history, and this was based on some of my work I did for my dissertation, is there's now a much greater appreciation and understanding of the value, the economic value that distributed energy resources provide to the system. So this was back in the early 1990s. There's a group of engineers from Pacific Gas and Electric. They installed a 500 kilowatt solar photovoltaic array at a substation, the Kerman substation in California. And they began to evaluate, well, what are the values beyond just the capacity and the energy that this system can deliver to the bulk power grid? What are the other values that these distributed resources can deliver to the grid? And so they began to analyze those values and publish on them. So these, what they call non-traditional benefits of these distributed energy systems include loss reductions. When you produce electron at a power plant, deliver it many hundreds of miles to where it's consumed, there's losses along the way. So siting generation closer to where it's being consumed, you reduce those losses, those line losses. There's real economic value in that. More importantly, there's this idea that if you have an area in your grid that is constrained, say your substation is maxing out, or you're maxing out the load that it can satisfy, and you're starting to continue to see building in your region, you can use distributed energy resources to defer investments in upgrading those facilities. And they actually documented that if they were to, when they installed this system, 500 kilowatts, that they would defer the investment of a transformer for 4 years, saving Pacific Gas and Electric $400,000. Okay. So this was back in the mid-1990s. Fast forward today, now most utilities really understand the value of these distributed energy resources. You hear regulators and utility executives talking about non-wire alternatives to distribution constraints. So they're beginning to target efficiency programs to those areas that are constrained. They're also targeting distributed energy resources so they don't have to invest in upgrading those transmission and distribution systems. So that's another key driver. In addition to the changing cost structure, is this understanding and appreciation of the distributed benefits that these resources can provide. So now I'm going to, in the last part of my presentation, I want to talk about the tensions. Okay, these transitions are never smooth, and I would contend that the biggest challenge here will be understanding and figuring out how we can pay for all these investments in this large centralized system as we transition to a more distributed system. So utility companies have invested on our behalf, right? This is the utility compact. We'll build these power plants, we'll build these transmission and distribution systems, but you have to agree that you'll pay us over time by buying this electricity. And regulators oversee this process, and they determine what fair rates should be, and then utilities collect their money as we purchase electricity from them. So there's real tension as you transition from this centralized model to this distributed model. Is how are we going to continue to pay for the maintenance and the investments that have been made historically in that centralized grid architecture. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So first off, this actually represents an opportunity for utilities. So the strategic use of distributed energy resources can actually help them improve the utilization of their existing assets. They can, again, put distributed resources out on the distribution system, avoid investments that would be necessary if they didn't have those resources out there. And they can also use these resources to what we call shape that load, alter the load so that it makes it more efficient for them to use their existing transmission and distribution capacity. So this could involve smart appliances, demand response, turning on and off motors or drives in factories, turning on and off air conditioners in buildings, or turning off hot water heaters in homes. Or it could involve, again, using distributed storage systems. And so this is becoming increasingly valuable today as utility companies are required to accept more and more intermittent resources on the grid. So states are required, utilities in many states across the country are required through renewable portfolio standards to invest in renewable energy technologies. Most states across the country require utilities to purchase renewables at some percentage of the overall energy that they deliver to their customers. So this is a famous duck curve from California. California's been leading the investment in solar and other distributed energy resources. It's really affecting their load. They're seeing reduced loads during the daytime hours, in particular in the shoulder, spring and fall months. So you can use these distributed energy resources as a tool for utilities to manage that intermittency. And again, shape those loads so that they make more efficient use of their existing transmission and distribution infrastructure. One thing that I'm particularly excited about, we are seeing new loads coming on to the grid, in particular electric vehicles and thermal devices such as cold climate heat pumps, ice manufacturing systems for cooling buildings, and then in the middle here we have just a simple resistant heater that has bricks which can store thermal energy. So oftentimes we talk about these different ways we use energy in different silos: electricity, transportation, and then home heating. So what we're seeing is with these technologies, the convergence of those ways that we use energy towards electricity. So here in Vermont, we have a all fuels goal. So we want to get to 90% renewables by 2050, not just in electricity, but in home heating and transportation. And so that's going to be a real challenge. So I believe that electric vehicles and these thermal storage systems are going to play a critical role in meeting that goal. So these new loads that are appearing on the grid have this real value where they have latent energy storage, and they can be used as distributed energy resources, again, to manage the grid, use it more efficiently. I've done quite a bit of work on this concept of vehicle to grid. And this isn't really futuristic, where cars are connected to the grid, and they can take power and they can push power back and forth to the grid, depending on, say, responding to the intermittency of a solar array or a wind farm, or just responding to peak demand during the afternoon hours and levelizing that load. In fact, as I mentioned, I'm working with Energy, and in New York City, we're demonstrating 5 vehicles that have this capacity. There are these chargers that can go bidirectional. The Nissan Leaf actually has the capability of pushing power in both directions. So these systems are very much on the horizon. And heat pumps and thermal storage systems, again, have this latent storage capacity, which allows us to use them as distributed energy resources to create benefits for the grid. And again, it brings this together from not just electricity to home heating, cooling, and transportation. So that's a very exciting prospect. So that's the benefit to utility companies and regulators about this emergence of these distributed energy resources. But it also creates a challenge for utility companies, a real threat to their existing business model. Think about solar on your roof, batteries in your basement, and you can just simply unplug from the grid, no pun intended. And this is a chart from the Rocky Mountain Institute, Emory Lovins. They did a whole analysis of what they call grid defection. When will it be cost effective for customers to put solar on the roof, batteries in their basement, and just disconnect from the grid? And so that levelized cost of solar plus storage, they compare to the average price of power in the region. It's already cost effective in Hawaii to have these systems. And then each New York, they project 2025, California 2031, and then later in the later in this century, it will become cost effective in other jurisdictions as well. So this is a real threat to the traditional business model of utilities. Bulk power delivered to their customers. Now customers are going to have more options using these distributed energy resources to manage the way that they use electricity. So I should mention that it's not only a problem for utility companies, but it's also a bit of a challenge for regulators. Regulators work with utility companies, oversee what they do, how much they invest, and they establish rates so that they're compensated for those investments. So utility regulators as well want to make sure that they can make sure that the utilities are whole from their investments, but also encourage technology innovation, technology adoption. So it really does create this challenge. So it's my belief that we are now seeing the early stages of this tension between how do we pay for this system and how do we move to, as we transition to this distributed energy system, distributed energy model. And so we're seeing across the country net metering as a flashpoint. Okay, those of you, net metering, put solar on your roof. If you're producing more electricity than you're consuming instantaneously, it pushes that power onto the grid and your meter spins backward and you're credited for that, the full retail rate. And net metering has been a huge policy innovation which has allowed for the explosive growth of the solar industry across this country. It's been a critical regulatory innovation which has allowed for the explosion in the grid-connected solar photovoltaic market. So what we're seeing now, though, unfortunately, is utility companies beginning to make powerful arguments saying, well, that was good for some time until we got this industry off the ground, but now the industry is healthy, it's growing, and we want to rethink this arrangement. Okay. So just in the past year, we had 2 significant PUC rulings, Public Utility Commission rulings, which essentially gutted the net metering programs in those states. So instead of getting retail credit for that electron that you push back onto the grid, you're going to get less than retail credit. And also they're saying, well, we have to build the transmission distribution system. Maybe you should pay demand charge or a standby charge. And so these arguments carried the day in Nevada and Hawaii. In Nevada was really quite draconian, and they actually was retroactive. So if you had invested in solar, change the rules, and now that investment looks very different today than it did just a year ago. So this is really, this is just the edges of this tension that I'm trying to describe as we transition from a centralized to a distributed, and it's only going to intensify. I should note that California did recently reaffirm its net metering program, and they are continuing to allow net metering credit based on retail rates. They did make a few changes, but they were quite minor, so that was a huge victory for the solar industry. And we're going to see this all over the country. It's happening here in Vermont. Public Utilities Commission here in Vermont is in a net metering proceedings. They're looking at varying the net metering rate based on location, size, whether you keep the credits, the renewable energy credits, or hand them over to the utilities. So all of these things are really coming to a head, and it's all around net metering. And so this is just the start of this transition. So there are lots of messy issues. I mean, it's exciting, right? Technology, clean energy, solar, wind, but there are a lot of messy issues that have to be dealt with as we make this transition. And I've listed some of them, some of the things that I think need to be addressed as we make this transition. integrating DERs into resource planning processes. That's just starting to happen in different jurisdictions. We need to rethink some of the regulatory frameworks and the rates to encourage utility ownership, investment in distributed energy resources, and again, doing that in a way that benefits all stakeholders. And also, we need to think about new business models for utilities. Green Mountain Power, if you hear Mary Powell talk, she's all about trying to figure this out. She's on really the cutting edge of thinking, how can they remain a viable business in this transition to a distributed energy future? She doesn't want to be a typewriter manufacturer. Typewriter manufacturers don't exist now. So my view is, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that really it's going to take a collaborative process. It's going to take all stakeholders from across the spectrum to come together through a collaborative process, work through these issues, and make this transition that we know we need to make, low carbon energy future. And now we've got electric vehicles, heat pumps, and other electric technologies for thermal purposes. And we can really begin to make significant progress towards what I started this talk with about this imperative that we address climate change. So many folks are pointing to what's happening in New York State, our neighbor here in New England, through their reforming the energy vision. And they are systematically going through a collaborative stakeholder process to go through these issues. And it's lengthy, it's messy, it's cumbersome, perhaps boring at times. But I think that's the model that probably makes the most sense as we transition, because there is legitimate arguments that we must pay for these investments that have made over time, but at the same time we want to adopt and embrace new technology that makes sense and benefits us. And we need to think of that more broadly, not just about the price per kilowatt hour, but think of that more broadly in terms of the environment and these distributed benefits that I've been describing. So, losing my voice, sorry, allergies this time of year. So with that, I'm going to open it up to comments and questions. And I know we've got a bunch of experts in the audience, so I'm going to defer to some folks if there's something that I can't answer. So thank you very much. Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about improvements as far as electric vehicles are concerned, particularly when they're traveling long distance and you're charging them and things like that. If there are any moves on a regulatory level or whatever, as far as getting gas stations to install charging stations or improving the rate at which cars can be recharged.
Yep. That's a great question. So really about the state of the electric vehicle industry adoption infrastructure. Again, I think we're very much in the early stages of that story. Some states have some programs which create incentives to install charging stations. And there's lots of private developers that are building public charging networks. Energy, the company that I'm collaborating with, they have a company called EVgo, and they've got the largest EV charging network across the country. And they've included in that a number of fast charging stations. So if your car has capacity, you can recharge your vehicle within 30 minutes using these fast chargers that they've installed. So I would say that there's still a need for improvement in technology. The batteries are getting close. And Tesla, of course, now is really pushing the envelope on that. But there's also this understanding, the way that we drive, there really is, it's a niche. Most of our drives on a daily basis are less than 30 miles per day. So an electric vehicle could satisfy 99% of our travel and our mobility needs. Then those occasions where you need to go to grandmother's house, we got to drive a longer distance, then that creates a challenge for existing vehicle technology. So I would say, that the technology, there's certainly room for improvement. B, the infrastructure is starting to be installed mostly by private developers. I'm not familiar with a lot of state programs other than some small incentives to encourage the installation of EV chargers. Kevin and I are talking about possibly collaborating, talking about what would make sense in Vermont or elsewhere about what types of incentives to encourage the development of an infrastructure or adoption of electric vehicles. Because electric vehicles really represent an historic opportunity for new load for utility companies, right? Loads have been flat in New England. The use of electricity has been kind of flat or declining. So electric vehicles represents, a new source of revenue for utility companies. So if we can understand what that value is and how we can incentivize that to benefit all stakeholders, that would be important. Good question. Yes, sir.
Question that, so you talk about solar where it's produced. You give the example of Vermont, it's paid, people are paid the same no matter where they produce it. But as you move to a distributed generation model, the value of solar varies where it's placed.
Right.
Are there any public utility commissions, public service commissions that are exploring how to deal with that level of granularity in incentivizing solar placement in certain areas or renewable energy placement in certain areas in their rate structures as they revisit net metering program?
Yeah, that's a great question. I forgot to bring this out, but you don't get to wave around your dissertation that much, but I'll wave this around. And I was really interested in this concept of marginal, time and location specific marginal pricing of electricity. That was part of my dissertation. And I would say that utility companies understand that the value of solar and distributed energy resources varies by location. I'm not really familiar with any real extensive efforts to try to reflect that into the rates. I mean, typically, most people are on a flat rate, right? You pay the same per kilowatt hour regardless of season, regardless of time of day. Many places have time of use rates, which sometimes vary with the season. So the rate will vary depending on the time of day. But I think utilities are really working to understand how the costs within the distribution system vary. And I don't know yet that we're at that level where there's rates or regulatory incentives that are really going to encourage the placement or the siting of distributed energy resources in such a way that's going to really maximize the economic benefits of that.
California is incentivizing turning solar panels westward.
Yes.
To move back.
Yeah, the duck curve. If you can orient west, or east, depending on, you can really deal with that ramping that occurs in the morning and the late evening when the sun's setting. And so I think that's a future, for more complex regulation, time and location specific values, and understanding those and trying to reflect those in decisions about where we place this stuff. It's a great idea.
The observations on the relationship of tension between homeowners, Tesla, and the utility companies, and how they are developing whatever models they're coming up with.
Tell me a little bit more about.
PNP is promoting the use of the Teslas.
Yeah.
The homeowners with PV on the roofs. Do you have anything on that?
I'm not all that familiar. I mean, I would understand that. I think that what you pay for Green Mountain Power varies on whether they allow you to control the if you let utility control the battery dispatch, then you pay a different rate than if you just control it yourself. So.
When you might need it the most, if I understand their proposal correctly.
What's that?
They may also be able to draw it down when you might need it the most, if I understand what their models are.
That if you relinquish control to the utility, that may be their decision. It's the best. They're going to use it to their advantage, to their economic advantage. But distributed solar could have these algorithms that are just responding to the solar output and buffering that solar. I would imagine that's probably how they're anticipating using those storage systems to kind of buffer the variability in the solar. As a cloud goes over, it'll push power out, and as the cloud comes down, it'll charge the battery. There's all sorts of, it's lots is going on. Huge. It's overwhelming to keep abreast of what's happening. But smart grid technologies, there's companies that are developing these systems. I'm of the opinion that there's much more opportunity out there of technology and systems than utilities are actually capable of dealing with right now. I was talking with, I noticed you had ChargePoint chargers up front. I was talking to an executive at ChargePoint for a project I was doing with VEIC last year. And he's saying, we've got cloud-based information analytics and sending the information back and forth. He's like, we could feed it to the utilities, but they're not prepared to deal with it. They just don't have the back-end capacity within their IT departments to take this information and utilize it in a way that would really benefit. And that's changing. But again, I think that's part of the regulation is incentivizing utilities to invest in those upgrades so that they can take this information, use it, and manage the grid more efficiently. Does that answer your question?
Really? But thank you.
Okay. Melissa.
Okay, so you mentioned how Green Mountain Power doesn't want to become the typewriter manufacturer. And that, I enjoyed your talk. One thing that it leaves me questioning is whether or not we need to rethink the utility model. And if you have thoughts on that, if the utility model is in conflict with our ability to meet the climate imperative that is before us, then what needs to change about that model so we don't keep producing typewriters in an age when we're using computers?
Right. That's a great question. And there's been a lot of discussion about this in utilities. Talk about being the platform, information, the platform. They've got the hard assets, the distribution and transmission system, being the platform, and then coordinating all these different resources as they're integrated onto the system. And less so about delivering electrons. I mean, this was an argument. I don't know if you guys remember the demand side management days, energy efficiency days in the 90s, where utilities were required to help their customers use less of their product through efficiency. And the utilities are like, well, but we make money by selling them electricity. Why am I gonna? So you have to change the incentive structure so that they're incentivized to help their customers use less electricity. So that same concept is we need to change the regulatory model, the structure, so that they're incentivized to encourage economic investments in distributed energy resources. And so that's an important area to be developed that I think needs significant work. And there's lots of folks thinking about this, and there's different ideas out there, but I don't think anyone's yet cracked the code on this to figure out how can we continue to pay for this, move to this, and make this transition to low carbon energy future. So it's a challenge for sure. Yes, sir.
It seems that a lot of power is going online during the day when the sun is shining and putting in these 20 megawatt, 100 acre, they keep popping up. How is the other end handling the storage of that energy that pulses on the line? You know what I mean? Do you have enough batteries all over the place, or pump storage, or how are you leveling it out?
Well, today there isn't a lot of storage on the grid. So when solar reaches a certain penetration level, at low levels, 1-2%, the grid is designed to deal with variability, right? Demand goes up and down, varies. It's very predictable. And so solar, as it reaches a certain percentage penetration on the grid, then that creates more challenges in managing that pulsing, that variability of the resource. So we really haven't had that level of solar on the grid that's really required us to have that storage. And we are getting to the point in some locations, on some circuits, in some areas, where that variability is creating technical challenges. And so the way I like to think about dealing with intermittency starts first by forecasting. There are very sophisticated tools using weather models to forecast hour ahead, 15 minutes ahead, what the resource production will be from variable wind and solar generators. So if you can predict it, you can plan for it. Secondly is to use demand response. Stop charging my vehicle when the cloud comes over, and then charge it when the cloud goes away, or turn off my water heater when the cloud comes over, and turn it back on when the cloud moves away. So I think Emery Lovins talks about this, orchestrating all these different resources using smart technology. Other folks, Jeremy Rifkin talks about the energy grid, this kind of smart intelligent system that's responding autonomously to changes in conditions on the grid. We're certainly not there yet. I don't think we've really needed it to this date in terms of the level of intermittency on the grid, but we're getting close in some areas. So right now there isn't the storage, which is out there to do that buffering. But I think, in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see a lot more of that. California is incentivizing investments in distributed storage systems. Again, they're a leader in terms of solar deployment. So does that answer your question? Yes, sir.
How does the New York REV program consider DER for renters and people who live in multifamily homes who can't, who don't necessarily have the roof space to offset just their family's energy usage?
Yeah. I don't know the specifics on REV dealing with that particular, which I know it's a big issue in New York State. There's a lot of people that rent in multifamily buildings, and so there's a lot of discussion about that. Community solar is one way that they've allowed those people who don't have roof space or live in multi-family, multi-dwelling structures to invest in solar. But I don't know specifically how the REV proceedings are dealing with that. I'd have to look that up. So I think I've got time for one more question, and then we got to let you go to your class. I know Kevin's got to teach. Other folks got to go to class. Yes.
So thanks very much for this. It's very thought-provoking, and I'm fascinated by the commons problem that you sort of alluded to. That is that at some point you will wind up inevitably with people who can pull themselves off the grid and say, sorry to the rest of you about the contribution I'm supposed to be making, but I can do this myself. Is there anybody else here from Rethink Health or who's worked with Rethink Health? Okay, so I'll try not to speak out of school on this, but I'm working at the Dartmouth Institute with folks who are working in the commons problem with healthcare system. And Rethink Health is a national project that is looking at the possibility of solving some of our community health problems by getting ultra local and having community sustainable health financing and programs, et cetera. And it looks very much like this. And so aside from the financial issues, some of the sustainability problem deals with the sort of ethics of the commons. And I'm wondering if, so energy is one example, healthcare is another example, but there are several kinds of crises that we're facing. And I'm wondering if these sectors are speaking to each other at all about those sort of interdisciplinary concerns.
I'm pretty narrow on the grid thing, so I can't answer that question. But this is a huge issue. If people all of a sudden start dropping off from the grid, then that's going to leave all these other people holding the bag, paying for this infrastructure, and that keeps regulators up at night. If this disruptive technology really takes us to where it could take us, it's going to really create this serious equity issue in terms of folks that aren't able to invest in unplug from the grid system. So I think that's a similar challenge in food systems and in other areas as well. But I'm not familiar with any kind of integrated approach. I'm all for systems thinking and seeing this come together. But
so potentially a place for lawyers to get involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, on that, I just advise you to look at the New Economy Law Center at Vermont Law School, and David Bollier's work on the commons in particular pulls in all different fields. So I think that might be something that would help you. We need to wrap up. Thank you for a great hour. See you all next Tuesday.
Like